Excellent. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special Virtual Horror Con edition of Gehenna Gaming Interviews. Today, I have the personal extreme pleasure of interviewing the minds behind my favorite podcast, the Magnus Archives. Jonathan Sims, or Johnny, and Alexander J. Newall, Alex, are, thank you for joining me.
No problem at all. Happy to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. For those unfamiliar with the Magnus Archives or Rusty Quill, the company that created it, first, go listen to the episode, preferably after Virtual Horror Con, but ASAP. And secondly, the Magnus Archives is a horror fiction podcast written by Jonathan Sims, directed by Alexander J. Newall, and produced by Rusty Quill. The show launched in about 2016, I believe.
I think so, 2016 or 2015. I can never remember
so
which.
Many years ago.
Ages ago.
That's how long ago it is.
Aeons past, another age, another life.
And as of this past Thursday, April 2nd, it started its fifth and sadly, for me, final season. Johnny, you are the narrator for the podcast in character as the eponymous main character, actually. And
for my sins.
At the beginning of the series, the newly appointed head archivist of the Magnus Institute. The show is critically acclaimed with a massive fan following, as I can see from the fact that our viewer count just tripled when I started this interview. And extensive lore behind it. I will warn viewers that we may discuss some spoilers for later seasons if you've never watched the show. So I suggest you go watch it. Or listen, sorry. So listener or viewer, since this is originally airing on Twitch, beware. So Johnny, Alex, thank you for joining me. How are you faring in our quarantine state?
I'm broadly speaking doing okay, actually. A lot of background stress because, hey, it's a real scary time. But I'm actually pretty well built for staying indoors for long periods of time. Also a little bit nervous, to be honest, about the opening of season 5 because it was written a long time before any of this sort of started. But looking at the first sort of 3 or 4 episodes of the of season 5, they're a bit close to home, I would say, in the current scenario. Yeah, literally.
Yeah, that's something we can talk about if you would like to, but also I know you posted a very nice message at the beginning of season 5 about that, as well as on social media explaining your decision to stick with what you had written.
There was a lot of back and forth on it, I have to admit, because you don't want to seem to be making light of, something very serious, very global in its effects, that has massive ramifications for years to come. But at the same time, there's an argument to be made that if you are curtailing the story that you are told to get around that as a thing, you're actually potentially doing an injustice. But it was a whole thing, and I think in the end, the best that we could do is just listen and beware, put as many warnings as we can, be very upfront with people about what is being covered, and make sure that people know. And yeah, Johnny's right. The first few are very heavy involved in, again, ideas of being sort of isolated in a fixed location and things like that. And there are other elements that come up later in the season, which are riffing on different aspects of the things that are happening in the world, but those I can't go into right now.
Yeah. For those who aren't aware, like I mentioned, it is the 5th season, and the concept of, this is a spoiler, so mute if you don't want to know, the concept of the end was introduced in season 4, and that's
everything has changed in quite a significant way.
Yes. So kind of launching into my pre-prepared interview questions, what was the inspiration behind the Magnus Archives? That's, I think, the big question, really. Like, where did this idea come from originally?
So it's, a lot of places. And it kind of came in stages. I initially, Alex approached me maybe 2015, 2014, when I was part of a performing group called The Mechanisms, and Alex had seen the show and said, "Hey, do you guys want to be involved in this podcast company I'm setting up?" To which the response was, "It takes us about a year and a half to write 8 songs. We're not really in a position to do anything on a podcast schedule." But at that time, I was working nights, and I was listening to a lot of. It was right at the sort of the first rise of like horror podcasts. So I was listening to a lot of Pseudopod. No Sleep podcast had just started. There was I found a huge old archive of like Lights Out and Nightfall and all these old radio shows. And so I came to, and Knife Point Horror as well had sort of just started up, which are still a personal favorite. And I came to Alex and I was like, "Hey, I would really like to have a horror story anthology podcast where there are these," because I come from, I love that stupid meta plot building in 90s RPGs where every single setting had this huge sprawling meta plot over like 5 different mega campaigns. And so I was very much like, but I'd like there to be this world in the background and the stories sort of start to link together. And to which Alex went, "That sounds great, but it needs an actual plot." And then we sort of started to really hammer out the story, hammer out the world and the fears and all this sort of thing.
Alex,
I don't really have much more I can add to that. You've gone through most of it. I remember initially the pitch was very much more anthology based, where it was very much closer to I suppose things like Knife Point's a good touchstone for that kind of thing. And we were very aware, sort of at the Rusty Quill side, at the production side, that if you're going to make something of the kind of scale that we were interested in making, you have to have some element of consistency in terms of characterization. And the issue with the anthology, in pure anthologies, you end up with one of 2 cheats. Cheat number 1 is that you have one character getting in just all kinds of scrapes all the time, and it gets real peculiar that they aren't taking any active steps to avoid these situations. Or option number 2, you have a cast of thousands and it starts to fall apart a little bit because it's very difficult to remain engaged in a character when they've got about 15 minutes of life left in them, and then they're gone and the next one's in. So I think a lot of the very early stage was, how do we take the bits that we want from anthology and then start to mash in an ensemble in a way that you can have consistent stakes between episodes while still keeping that anthology feel.
It's also why the main character has my name, because at the beginning it was conceived, like the archivist character was conceived in an almost a crypt keeper sort of style, if that makes sense. The host and narrator who contextualizes the stories, and then it started to actually because once we actually were like, no, it does actually need a proper plot and a proper world, we kind of ran away with it because we both love a big sprawling sprawling plot like that. And at no point did I think I should probably not have the same name as the main character anymore, now that he's actually a character who is incredibly distinct from myself.
You say it at no point. There were a couple of conversations of, now Johnny, we're about to pull the trigger on this. We can change the name. Are you sure? I'm sure it'll be fine. I'm sure there are no.
I don't remember those conversations, Alex. I mean that whole time it's such a blur.
So did you? I'm actually going to jump order on questions because sure. You sparked this one. Did you kind of conceive of the entire show from start to finish initially, or has it evolved dramatically over the seasons? Have you changed things because you thought it something would work better, or you thought that it would? Something happened naturally through the writing of one season. You went, you know what? I think it would be. I don't think that's how this would turn out because of that.
So I think, from my point of view, and Alex, you may disagree with the audience. From my point of view, I think it went. It effectively went the world then the ending, then the seasons, if that makes sense. So like once we decided that we wanted to have this big meta plot, it started out with, well, what's the world this takes place in? And so we worked out all the details of the fears, sorry, the entities, all that sort of thing. Then we went to, then we figured out, well, how do we want it to end? What do we want the final state to be? And that's drifted slightly throughout the course of the season, because all writing the seasons, because over the course of 5 years things slightly adjust, but it's still very much where we're aiming for. And then we worked through basically each season individually.
I think the best way to describe it is, in those early meetings, I mean, anyone who does writing will know this, like it's a mistake to go too mushy or too rigid. As in, if you go in and you know every single point and every single beat and every single thing, that means that what you're going to start doing is you're going to start fighting your characters, because certain beats are going to come out slightly different to how you intended, or certain angles are going to start, certain themes are going to start bubbling up that seem a little bit more prominent. I know I can speak for both of us, like the stuff that came up with The Lonely ended up being a
that was
bigger theme than was originally conceived multiple years ago, but a lot of that is just in the execution. So the best way to think of it is, you build this scaffold, and you want a rigid scaffold. You want to know what your destination is, and you want to know what your broad points are, but there is flex in,
and you want plenty of hooks all over
that we can finally share. Actually, the cliffhanger for the end of season 4, we had significant discussions about when that was going to drop. Was that going to drop at the end of season 4? Was it drop in the first quarter of season 5 and throw?
My original pitch was actually that the big change happen about 8 episodes into season 5, like episode 4 so the end of season 4 be kind of a false climax, and then like about 7-8 episodes into season 5, this comes out of absolutely nowhere, which I'm still a little bit sad that we couldn't absolutely blindside everyone with that, but Alex was like, no, structurally it works a lot better as a season cliffhanger. And he was 100% right.
I think also part of it though is, and again we discussed it before, is it's not often that you have a series that you work on that spends a significant portion pre this kind of an event and also a significant portion post. You tend to weight very heavily in one or the other, either with flashbacks to before or flash forwards or whatever. I see a sneaky cattail there.
Oh yeah.
You can't hide cats from us.
I wanted to be the people that got everyone used to the world as was, and then spent a good chunky season really diving into the ramifications.
You answered a question I had, which was kind of how that cliffhanger was going to set the tone for season 5 perfectly. I think that for those who haven't listened to it yet, I don't want to give too much details, but there was a reality changing event for the show, and the first episode captured exactly what I envisioned would happen afterwards. I think you did an amazing job with that. But as you've mentioned, things are going to progress through this season.
I mean, I think it's just the thing that interests us is there are so many places that deal with averted apocalypses, and so many places that deal with like post-apocalypse finishing, but there's very few that really dive into like mid-apocalypse. The transition, well, what does this world actually look like? Either this world's averted, this changes a long time in the past, or this change is like the climax that ends everything. And it really, I mean, with so much of Magnus, what it comes down to is us saying, well, what actually interests us about this idea? What is it in this trope or this setup that we really want to dive into? And with season 5, we really want to dive into like, what is this new world and how does it reflect on the characters that we've spent so long getting to know?
Personally, I kept coming back to, and again, this is a very close to the bone reference now, obviously, but say what you like about the work, but like The Stand, Stephen King, is one of the ones that
It's
I
actually
always
one of
come
the-
to as a full transitional one, where it starts prior to everything going wrong, it has the full transition into, and then the events after. So personally, that was something that I would always keep coming back to as interesting. However, we could never follow the same kind of route, because that was very much a scientific cause with a spiritualistic overlay, whereas Magnus has a way heavier metaphysical bent. So as a result, we can't really spend hours going, how long would a power plant last, you know, with a 6,000-foot scorpion living inside it? Because it's not that kind of a story.
Yeah, the questions we want to get into is, well, what is that power plant now?
Yeah.
You know, now that we are in a world of metaphor, what is that power plant become?
Right. And the way that it'll be interesting to see also how the other entities react to all of this. That is what I am most excited for. So with this being the final season, do you have plans for any follow-up media related to the Magnus Archives? Are there any, you don't have to give details, but obviously, but anything else kind of percolating that you might want to be doing adjacent to the podcast or the stories behind it?
So I would say we haven't precluded doing stuff tied to this universe by any stretch, and we are sort of in talks about things in the planning stages and the early planning
Secret
stages,
talks.
like that. Yeah, but we literally cannot go into any details of that at all. What I can say categorically is there's not going to be a version where season 5 of the Magnus Archives finishes and then 6 months down the line we have, oh, and here's season 6, where it's that false ending, you know, the what you can think of as like X-Files syndrome, where it's had about 8 endings at this point. That's not a thing that we're interested in. So for Magnus specifically, although there are avenues we're exploring, there isn't really anything formally that we can dive into beyond we're not against it, but you're not going to be getting a full revival. But I know that Johnny, for instance, Stand Over to You, has been doing quite a lot on the book recently, which is not Magnus specific.
Yeah, we've obviously got projects that are coming up post Magnus. They are not directly related to Magnus. So I've got a book coming out with Orion Glance in August, I believe, called 13 Stories, which I'm really excited about. But while it has a lot of tonal similarities with Magnus, because that's what I like to write in a ghost story, it's not connected to the actual world. I will say that, like, broadly speaking, while we are looking into various things, and there's every likelihood that this is not the last of the world of the Magnus Archives that might come out, this story is ending. Season 5 is the end of the story of the podcast, the characters, the arcs, all that sort of stuff. That is coming to a close in a way that I love a good ending, and I'm always very reluctant to reopen a proper ending.
Well, I mean, to really like over summarize, the Magnus verse is not closed for business, but this story is going to end. Because it has to, because otherwise you live long enough to become just very kind of mushy, no consequence. Suddenly everyone's coming back to life, and I'm not interested in that as a story. I'm just not.
I can say I personally certainly appreciate that. Things need to have a beginning and an end. You cited some good examples there with the X-Files and other shows that ended several times and then didn't. So I think it's
to put it on the writers as well, to be clear. Like, a lot of the time there are external pressures where you will write the best ending you can, and then if you're beholden to an external studio, which we're not, you can have that external studio go, do it again, and you either do or someone else comes in. And it's nice to not be under that kind of pressure, I have to admit.
I'll be honest, it's hard to overstate the luxury almost of knowing exactly how long we have to work with, like of going to Alex, hey, I would think that this would work well over this 5-season arc. And I think 40 episodes within each season would work well. And Alex going, grand, we'll do 5 seasons of 40 episodes, and just having that solid and known and being able to write that is, I mean, as far as I'm that basically never happens in media production.
Not
you
really.
realistically,
It's an odd model.
Yeah, you will almost never know how, and this is where so much TV ends up being unsatisfyingly structured, because you almost never know how long you're actually going to get to tell your story, which makes properly weighting it always a difficult proposition.
Absolutely. You raised a point there I want to touch on briefly.
Sure.
The fact that you are your own self-contained studio, and you do have other properties you're working on. We'll talk more about those a little bit later. What is it like with, you obviously had, the cast has evolved over the series. And some of the people who are no longer cast members on the show are still very heavily involved with the rest of Rusty Quill. Was some of those character departures scripted? Was it because those people had too many other responsibilities because of their day jobs or their other work? Or was it always kind of like, yeah, we know that Mike LeBeau is a great example. He played Tim. He's still very heavily involved in Rusty Quill work. I believe he's had a video. He's participating in some of our other content here for VirtualHorror Con. To my point, was that kind of scripted? Those characters leaving the show for whatever reason they leave.
Yes. In Mike's case specifically, his character left because it was the right time for the character to leave. It was something that had been discussed, and I think very, very originally it was intended to be part of a mid-season 4 climax, but it was moved to season 3 because we were shuffling stuff around. But it was very much, and you'll notice that his voice has not entirely departed, because when we are very keen for, even when characters have left the story, they have still existed in that world, and their presence is still very much felt throughout. So in Mike's case, it was the progression of the story. Mike is the loveliest man in the world, and I'm very much not going to be like, oh, I'm sick of seeing Mike all the time. We'll just write him out. I think the only character who's been written out for production reasons was Sasha in season 1.
Yeah.
Where there was
I can confirm that there's only ever been one where production situations imposed a little bit on the story shapes and so on. And that was for Sasha, who was played by Lottie Broomhall. The reason being for that is that Lottie ended up taking on a rather shiny and special job, working fairly high up in major IPs. I don't know if I can reference, but that most listeners would be aware of.
It was quite we were like, oh, that's a good job. Yeah, definitely take that, even if it means you can't be on our show.
Exactly, because at the time Lottie was actually our head of marketing as well. Right. And then did a sort of running leap into something fairly major. So as a result, we were like, okay, cool. Thankfully, there was already enough in place that we could take the story structure that was pretty much already there and just sort of angle it. Because I think we have said it before that way back, and we're like pre-season 1, we were mulling, okay, someone is going to be, got in this season, who's it going to be, and blah, 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 blah. But thankfully, we had so much notice in terms of what Lottie's situation was, and the people that she was working with were being very good about it. They weren't sort of slamming the door shut. They let us close that sort of angle out. So Lottie was the only example I can think of, but at the same time, it really wasn't
it dovetailed into what we were kind of planning to do anyway. It changed the details, but not the overall shape.
It played into our hands quite helpfully, thank goodness.
Nice. Fortuitous.
Yeah.
circling back around to the inspiration behind the show and kind of how you formulated it, the entities are obviously very core, and I think one of the things that I loved was binge listening to the first 2 seasons and kind of growing into what that was very quickly, and I can imagine what it was like listening to it episodically and more spaced out, and how that would build. But for those who haven't listened, and this is another spoiler, the entities are essentially based on humankind's greatest, most base fears. Fear of the dark, fear of spiders, fear of meat.
The viscera, the flesh is it's a complicated one. It's not so much fear of meat as fear of being meat.
Yeah,
that sort of existential fear.
Plus,
that
let's not forget Cronenberg here. Like, you got to work that stuff into somewhere.
Also, like literally just fear of body horror, like that sort of, you look at something that's wrong in a very fleshy way, and you're like, ah.
Yeah. That one always, whenever I'm explaining it to people and I get to that one, they're like, wait, what? And I usually reference Cronenberg. Two-part question. Did that list evolve over time, or did you kind of already go like, okay, these are the ones we want to include? Or did you kind of say, did you add on any later on? Because you went, oh, hold on, this fits this perfectly. And I know you mentioned that the lonely evolved, and what role it would play, but was the list of entities kind of like ironed out from the start?
So, I mean, within the world of the Magnus Archives, like the entities do change over the sort of the long period, because fundamentally what living beings are afraid of changes, has changed over the course of the past. Within the production, within the writing of the show, I think it took about a month or so of discussion and sort of hacking it together to get the list. And during that period, there was a lot of sort of mixing around. Like, for instance, the powers of the hunt and the slaughter at various points were a single power or split into 3 different powers, because they were because the fear of violence, the fear of pain, the fear of, and it, in the end, a lot of it came down to us trying to boil it down to, okay, well, this isn't necessarily this isn't like the fear of being stabbed. This is what is that? Are you afraid of the pain? Are you afraid of the randomness of this violence? Are you afraid that somebody is coming for you? Exactly. And so that there was quite a lot of wrangling, and it's interesting because periodically people will say, oh, well, what about this sort of major phobia that's not directly covered by one of the fears? And it's very much the case of while we do tie specific phobias into specific fears, we tie arachnophobia into the web, but that's in many ways kind of a metaphorical sort of overlap, because whereas the web is fundamentally more about the fear of loss of control, of being bound, and or the fear of heights playing into the vast, which is a very strong phobia, but that's still, it's not so much that the vast is about that phobia as that phobia, when you look at it, comes from that sense of the void.
Yeah, it's a mistake to think of them as phobias made manifest, because they're not, and they're not intended to be. It's more almost fear cues, which is kind of different thematically. I remember there were 2 that were a bit of an odd one that were sticking points. There was one was, we talked a lot about where war fit in. And we were like, okay, is it this one? Is it this one? Is it a combination of these? Blah blah blah.
There was a point where war was a separate thing to the slaughter.
And it was when we were talking about war that the palette color metaphor started to come up, where we just the only way of dealing with this specific concept is to start merging here and looking at new combinations, rather than just you make it belong to one or the other. and the other one was in a very life imitates art. I know that the very last addition to all of them was again, major spoilers, the sort of the idea of like the extinction and that 15th power stuff was very much we had our core 14, and then a decent chunk of time later came in going, let's
actually this isn't easily covered.
And we
also
it was much later, which was life imitating art in a big way.
Also, it does, like, within the fiction, within the world itself, it does, like, these powers are distinctions drawn by people.
Yeah.
Like, people within the world are looking at how these entities manifest and saying, well, here is the line, and on this side of the line, you have the dark, and on this side of the line, you have the desolation. And like they all have overlap with each other, so it's very much intended as to be a little bit messy, because so much of it is this huge inhuman entities that are being grouped together somewhat artificially by people trying to understand things.
Someone took a fair spectrum and made a very helpful color wheel, but the problem is that it's still a spectrum even if you put it in a wheel.
Yeah,
right. I liked your analogy of the kind of the color spectrum, because you could say like, okay, yeah, maybe the vast is blue, but like how many shades of blue are there?
Yeah, exactly.
And when you start differentiating them from purple,
and like there's so many things that you can subdivide down, and
I think part of it was born of necessity as well, because very, very early we were like, okay, let's just be as complete as we can. And at some point you realize you've drilled down so far that it's like,
oh yeah, there was one point where like I think like at some point I was like, Alex, I've got 30. It's too many. No one will be able to remember any of them.
I remember I genuinely was like, it's 14 too many. Do we rein it in from there? Like,
yeah, like, oh, that was another one. The corruption, which is like sort of this like squirming, like trypophobia, squirming insects, but also contagion disease. At one point, like that has been two different powers or the same power at various points in the early design process.
Right.
And yeah, there are a few where it was just like, we've got too many, and these ones, they have a similar brain taste.
Well, you even
squash them together.
You even actually play that out on the show to a degree, where the characters are having trouble differentiating some of them, and not, they're like, is this corruption? It's this the hive, or is this a different entity?
Yeah.
And I think that helped actually explain it very well to a listener, going, oh, okay, I understand how these are loosely structured to a degree. I do want to be, I want to ask one more question specifically about the show, and then kind of change topics a little bit. And this one's primarily for Alex, because it's about Martin. Martin is one of my favorite characters on the series, and his character journey has been spectacular. I think the character has evolved more than most of the other characters, particularly with season 4. Sure. Was that also, maybe you did mention, we've talked about how the way the Lonely played in was evolved as the show did, but did Martin's journey also evolve in kind of tandem with that?
I'm trying to think. So going way back, we're talking like pre-Powers. Wouldn't it be cool to do an anthology? One of the characters that I pushed for, but again, Johnny was just immediately like, yeah, let's do that. Good idea. Was we knew we'd need a foil. It's that simple. It's like, and we're talking super early. It was just like, look, there has to be a foil. And that whole Martin, if you let a dog in the archives or whatever it was, is the clearest manifestation of, hey, look, everyone, there's going to be a foil too. And let's leave it at that and then let it play out.
I think in that very first meeting where I was like, hey, here's this anthology I've got an idea for, you were like, he needs to hate someone. He needs to have an assistant that he really doesn't like. And I was like, yeah, no, okay, let's do that.
The fact that I was playing Martin was strictly for convenience. If I'm being brutally honest, is we knew that there'd be a lot of interactions between the Archivist and Martin, and ultimately, if we were when in the very early days when we were setting stuff up, it was a case of, look, I'm going to be at the recordings anyway, let's do that. But in terms of Martin's growth of as a character, he was, once things picked up beyond like we're talking like the first couple of episodes.
Yeah.
It was very much a case of that arc was more or less laid out. I would say The Lonely was the biggest effect on Martin that was larger than initially pushed for. And I don't mean that it fundamentally changed the way Martin works or what his destination, but think of it as a minor route alteration, where I don't think in the very early days we were going to lean on The Lonely quite so hard as we did.
Yeah.
We were going to be focusing a lot more on like how Martin engaged with fear as being distinct from how other characters engaged with fear, but it wasn't necessarily going to be so tied to The Lonely. However, the more that The Lonely came up throughout, never mind in season 4, it became very apparent that overlap was far too heavy to ignore. Yeah. So it became less about Martin engaging with fear and more about using The Lonely as a lens to start examining that. I'd say that broadly speaking, it's played out pretty much how it always was going to, but I think the whole Lucas connection was a lot stronger than maybe we initially had laid out way back when. But again, Johnny, certainly, because he's got a far better memory than I have.
Like certainly that, like right from the beginning, what like we'd be like, okay, well there's Martin, he's going to be the foil, and as soon as we started talking like 5-season arcs for these characters, I mean, there's only so many narratively satisfying places you can go with that sort of initial dynamic, and like I can't remember exactly what point in season 1 I think these characters end up together. I think that is the right trajectory. But as soon as we were like, oh yeah, actually that makes a lot of sense. It wasn't, I don't think it wasn't originally intended to be as plot significant, I think, as it ended up being. Like it was very much intended to be like the emotional journey of the series. But
like mid-season 1 was where we sort of pulled the trigger, where up to then we'd been toying with it, and it might even be slightly earlier than that, where we're just like, no.
It was a bit later, because we'd had a couple of actual appearances of Martin by the time we decided, actually this is a really good, this is a good direction to go in.
Yeah, because it was after we'd had like a couple, it was like 2 or 3 episodes into them having a bit of a dynamic between the two. And certainly by end of season 1.
Oh yeah.
Interesting. I can't pin it to a specific point.
I mean, this is the thing about being like having that flexibility and that ability to be a bit reactive within shaping the series, is that a lot of things emerged very organically, to the point where it's like, at what point did we decide X or Y? And generally the answer is either right at the beginning or dunno. Just it gradually happened, and at one point we were like, oh, this seems to be happening. Do we push it through fully, or do we like readjust trajectory? And generally we go, let's push it through, because that's the interesting choice.
I think it's a good demonstration of that stuff we were talking about earlier, where you want to have your scaffold but you don't want to be too rigid. This is a good example where, because there was a little bit of like ambiguity built in, that we could lean into the way the story wanted to be told. But again, Johnny sums it up better than I do.
That's wonderful. A little bit of a follow-up question. You don't have to elaborate. Obviously, it's a little more on the personal side, but like, were you two good friends before you started working on this together?
We actually met way back when. So before I'd seen the mechanisms, I met Johnny at...
we worked the same night shift.
Yeah, and I will put my hands up, and I confess this every time, which is Johnny goes, oh, I'm in this band, you should check it out. And I did the same reaction that every single person who has ever been invited to a band does, which is go, that sounds really interesting, I'll definitely go. And then carried on doing as I was, but because we were both doing the Edinburgh Festival in creative capacities, I was doing like 4 or 5 shows, and was just like, I need to see something and not do something. Immediately went, and then it's an awful confession. I own 4 albums in my entire life.
It's not an awful confession. You make it every interview.
I know it's but I have to own I have to own my problems. I have 4 albums: Paul Simon's Graceland, and then all 3 of the mechanisms that were available. And that was because I was a hard convert. But prior to that, Johnny was just this guy who was.
We got on very well. Like there was a reason that we like discussed being at the Fringe at the same time. Like we like it was a weird night shift because it was super like it was just quite silent and dead. There were about 80 people in a room just not talking, and you'd all like be listening to your music or your podcasts.
Then you take away the cubicles, but everyone still behaves like they're still there. Very odd.
But like, you know, you'd end up in the kitchen and have like a quiet chat, and like we always got on very well. Which so when we started working together, like we were already working from a baseline of we're really good friends, and then it turned out that we worked really well together as creative partners, and yeah, so. I'd say that we're good friends. I'd say that we're good friends. I'd
allow it at this point. That's but I would be lying if I didn't say that the sort of traditional narrative that people tell about it is true. It was a single mechanisms gig was the one where I went, okay, cool, right, I need to make something with these people or how do we do that? It was a specific gig that I went to that sort of flipped that switch.
Awesome. So I want to shift gears. I want to talk about some of the other aspects of Rusty Quill, some of the other things that you're involved with, specifically around tabletop gaming, because that's what this is, a tabletop gaming convention. Rusty Quill also has a prolific tabletop gaming podcast, a Twitch stream that launched semi-recently, and lots of content available on that side of things. I want to ask each of you kind of how you got into tabletop gaming and what the first game you played was. Johnny?
I got into it through my dad. My father has been a role player, I mean, all my life. And I remember sort of being 8 years old and sort of like sneaking down after I'd technically gone to bed and listening to these games going on. I think I managed to worm my way onto a Traveller game that they were doing, aged about 11, much to the looking back on it, much to the irritation, I think, of some of the members of the group who now had to moderate their language for an 11-year-old. The first game I remember properly playing was probably a D&D 3rd edition game that my dad ran for me, because when 3rd edition came out, I was about 12 or 13, and I was very much like, oh, cool, this is new. This is very much how I can get started in this hobby that really interests me. And I started running it, and I ran it for about a year or so before I discovered good RPGs. Little bit of shade on 3rd edition.
Yeah, a little bit. It deserves it.
But and since then, I've been doing it pretty much constantly.
Fantastic. Alex?
My route in is very weird, and I don't know many people know. I don't even know if Johnny knows this. So
I'm not sure. I'm actually excited to hear what this is.
Okay, so straight out of the gate, I grew up in a comparatively rural community, and did not have much in the way of local friends. I spent a lot of time like roaming the hills alone, kind of thing. But that meant that I didn't actually even become aware of RPGs until I was 20, I think. And the way I got into it is I was cast in. I used to do a lot of acting before I went more into the directing side, and I was cast in a comedic play, which was about a group of Dungeons and Dragons players who join a basically malicious self-help group. Where it was like the idea was that it was a self-help group, but it wasn't actually self-help. The guy was taking advantage of people, and they didn't need help because they didn't have a problem. Like that was the kind of angle, etc. This is years and years ago. Anyway, I didn't even know what Dungeons and Dragons was. So our director, a guy named RJ, he ran a game of D&D so that I would at least know what the heck the thing was about. It was just a smorgasbord. It was like a Christmas themed. Tom Cruise was stealing the Oscars, run through the most stripped down version of 3.0 ever, and at the end of it, I really, really enjoyed the game a lot. And so I ended up just finding a bunch of random strangers, sort of friend of a friend asking, and then joined someone else's ongoing game for that. And then ended up, I think 3.0 was the first game I ever played. But yeah, my in is a bit odd. But I only started sort of the GMing side where that was when I really broadened, because up to then I went through all the stages people have. Oh, what do you play? Dungeons and Dragons, because that's the only RPG. And then I started to GM and went, oh no, there's lots. How do I memorize them? Oh, you don't. Right, you just play what you want. I get it now. Okay. And it was at that point that I started running. It's at that point I set up Rusty Quill. Was just when I had finished GMing my first long campaign and went, right, I understand the landscape now and blah blah blah. But I came to it very late.
Interesting. So all three of us have now thrown a little shade at Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition. What is your favorite game system?
Oh, I mean, I don't really have, like, I mean, what game am I playing? Is the question. Because there are so many amazing different game systems for so many different sorts of game.
Right.
You know, for instance, I really love. I mean, setting wise, I've got I've always enjoyed. I've become increasingly aware of how problematic the setting is, but Deadlands is one that has sort of been part of my role-playing life for most of it, and I have a lot of residual affection for that. But system-wise, I mean, if I'm doing sort of an investigation-y high lethality thing, I'll probably use like the Cthulhu hack. If I'm going more sort of long, slow, I might like Trail of Cthulhu to go for a couple of horror ones. If I want something a bit like old school gritty but like high chaos, I really like Maze Rats, which I periodically run like an entirely improvised, like literally rolling the adventure title at the table, and then being like, in the city of the shrouded cannibal god, what is this adventure now?
Play that.
Yeah, I play that.
Yeah, no, and it was great fun. But so like the system, I've got a lot of systems that I really love, but so much of it depends on the game. I'm really currently into Blades in the Dark, which we're playing through at the moment. They decided to be a cult, perhaps unsurprisingly, of the Ghost Sun, because their logic being everything else has a ghost. The sun is dead. Sun probably has a ghost.
Oh.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay, Alex.
So again, due to having a weird route in where I have spent more time playing games for performance than I have playing games for pleasure.
Yeah.
Has led to a very severe warping of my experience of the RPG field. So I always had a soft spot for 3.5, not because it was the best built thing, but I liked that they set themselves the arbitrary goal of, do it.
Yeah.
How? Do it. Here's more rules. Do it. I liked that they were just like, we'll keep putting rules in and you can do anything. Yeah. And then we converted to Pathfinder, which is still to this day the system that we play the podcast in. Reason for that is it streamlined it a little bit. And the reason that I used that for the podcast was twofold. Firstly, at the time, it was a system that I knew in its entirety. I mean, I knew it all. Obviously, the way Pathfinder works, though, is there's so many additional bolt-ons and so on that at this point it's enormous. And this is Pathfinder 1.0. And the second one as well is that Pathfinder was very open about like, hey, if you want to check the details for this RPG game, you can online. I mean, they encourage you to buy the books, and obviously the books have more detail, and I always encourage people to do so. But at the same time, it was
game developers.
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, our listeners had to be able to follow along, and we set up the podcast initially very openly stating, because the actual play field, I mean, we set this up in like mid 2015. Our first episodes were explaining what an RPG was.
Oh yeah.
The field has really changed. So as a result, we needed something where people could basically Google what on earth are they talking about. Oh right, here's that rule that they talked about. and then go and get invested. So we spent a lot of our early episodes explaining stuff. But I'm interested in starting to play Pathfinder 2.0. I haven't done that yet. That's high up on my list. Because I actually play 5th Ed for a group for pure pleasure, where I don't do anything productive with it. I just play a game. I enjoyed a lot of the streamlining that they did. I know there's been a lot of backlash in terms of streamlining being anti-crunch and vice versa. I have to admit, like, I'm kind of pro streamlining, but again, I play primarily as a performer, so as a result, any streamlining is an absolute boon.
Also, D&D's
thing I've never brought up before, where I have been fascinated with one setting I've never had the chance to play, and I'm just about to start GMing in, which is Eclipse Phase.
Yes.
So Eclipse Phase is one where I genuinely, I am, I think today, getting my my full book for the 2nd edition, where I get to dive in and have a look at it. But I know the setting well because they made their settings available via Creative Commons. Went, have a look at it. And I looked at it and went, oh my God, you have multiple valid economies for a post-scarcity society. Oh my God!
Yeah.
You have mechanics for forking, and it's like, I would like to play 367
mechanics
independent
for what? Sorry?
the same person. Forking, yes. Splitting the same personality. You genuinely openly state, hey, yeah, I'll give you. You can play 300 iterations of the same person, and the rules don't even say that's a bad idea. They're like, go for it.
Yeah,
that's interesting to me. Obviously, like, this is coming from a place of ignorance. I haven't started to play it yet, but that was one that pinged up on my my radar in 1st Ed, and I went, wow, for something going from like cold to like out of the gates, you did a lot of setting work. So that drew a lot of attention to me. I drew a lot of attention to that, and I'm interested in that. So I'm looking forward to diving into sort of 2nd Ed as a thing. But I couldn't recommend it enough, and I laugh because so much of what Rusty Quill Gaming's core campaign became, what was already put in place before I became aware of Eclipse Phase, and then I just went, oh, I see what I've done here. I've made Eclipse Phase in Pathfinder. No wonder it's so weird. And it is, like, I can't help but acknowledge it. Like, I became aware of Eclipse Phase so far down the line that I'm not worried about like cribbing as such. But yeah, the parallels now I am aware of Eclipse Phase are marked.
I have also not yet played Eclipse Phase, but it's been on my radar for about half a year now. After seeing it,
I only know the name. I'm afraid it's not one but I'm definitely going to be looking into it now. I recommend
people like just dive into the setting materials that are available for free, because the freely available like open, I don't think it's open source, I think it's Creative Commons and stuff, is hugely in depth anyway, and genuinely for the sci-fi field, it is rare to get an RPG that takes all of these different elements and goes, here, look, it makes sense now, and you go, huh. Yeah, okay, great, fab.
My only problem with Eclipse Phase is when people say, okay, what's it about? And I'm like, it's sci-fi horror, but just here's read this. I can't explain it.
It's a tough one to sell someone on, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to combine 2 questions I had, which is on the player side. I know, like, personally, I'm a perpetual GM. I pretty much only run games.
I feel your pain.
Yeah. Favorite character that you've ever gotten to play? It could be an NPC as well. And favorite experience, and they don't obviously have to be tied together, but or I guess if you'd rather talk about the experience than the character.
I think for me, a lot of my favorite MP, it's mainly NPCs, because like I GM a lot more than I play, and I think my favorite NPCs tend to be, I do some game design work with MacGuffin and Company, which is we do Tabletop, and we do these sort of micro settings which are intended to be like, rather than huge sprawling epic campaigns, they're like, well, you can play through this in like 6 sessions, and we'll provide like idea NPCs, and often getting to voice these ones that that we've workshopped and like put a lot of heart into creating these NPCs, and then actually getting to voice them when running the game, I always love it a hell of a lot more than I thought I would. You know, like we come up with, you know, oh, here's a creepy coroner who's just super excited to get into those corpses, and then actually playing it, I'm like, oh no, this feels really lovely to play, because this is something that I've actually created and poured a lot of time into beforehand. In terms of experiences, I think it's the time that I convinced my players that their boss wasn't a monster for about a year by telling them correctly that their boss was a monster. Because I gave it as someone rolled a double 1 on an investigation roll, and I said, oh yeah, no, these records clearly indicate that Calhoun, you're like the boss of your agency. They're deep into this. They are one of these monsters. And so the rest of the campaign, the player that got that double 1 was like playing somebody who believes something erroneous, because they knew it came from a double 1. So they were like, no guys, he's definitely in. And everyone else was like, oh yeah, sure. And then that reveal at the end, ooh, delicious.
That's amazing.
I think for me, I couldn't narrow it down to one. I'm quite lucky in that both my favorite characters and my favorite experiences are available for other people to listen to, which is useful. My two favorite characters that I've enjoyed playing are a paladin by the name of Ed and a teleportation specialist by the name of Einstein. And the reason for that is similar for both, but in very different ways, which is because of the nature of how much ground you cover when you're playing for performance and things like that. There is a heavy improvisational element, and you rely on that scaffold that I've talked about a lot, and there has to be a lot of flex to keep things moving perpetually, smoothly, cleanly. But playing those two characters is wonderful because I just get to turn off huge tracts of my brain whilst playing them and not monitor what I say in any way, and then deal with the ramifications thereof. To play Ed, the goal is very, very simple. You just turn off everything that isn't lovely and see what happens. And then to play Einstein, Einstein's the one that everyone enjoys to play in some version, which is, let's play a roaming id. And, you know, everyone likes it. You love to play it, as long as you play it with that certain nuance of you don't be a problem for other players at the table, which I have seen people playing that as a type. And it's just nice to cut loose and genuinely just turn on the improv thing and keep talking until people stop you, and then just dealing with that. That's quite fun. My favorite experience is one that hasn't fully played out for listeners yet, but has fully played out in the recording studio, which is a long time ago, I openly stated I could never do anything to do with time travel. The reason being is it destroys campaigns wholesale. It is absolute campaign death. And I ended up in a situation with the campaign.
How did the last episode of how did the last season of Rusty Core Gaming go? Remind me.
Yeah. So the way that I handled that was with multiple aspects of time travel, where I threw a bunch of characters into the ancient past, and I also threw the current characters who weren't thrown into the ancient past forward by a year with no more than that, but with no knowledge of events that had happened.
Oh, fun.
But the reason that it comes as my favorite experience is, one, player reactions are phenomenal, and there's nothing quite so fun as going, cool, your characters have been out of the loop for how long? I don't know, year and a half, 2 years, everything's changed, and it's kind of your fault deal. But the other one is, I got to close the loop in a way that rarely comes off with time travel. And I got to because of two things. One, being very, very careful, and there being a backdoor built in that I made use of. And the second one is, one player specifically really got on board, and it hasn't gone off yet in the main campaign, but when it does, I didn't close the loop, a player did. Off their own back, without me steering them, they went, and then dropped this gorgeous little parcel that sewed that loop up. That was phenomenal, because that's not happened before for me, and I've seen campaigns just flounder in this kind of a situation. I didn't have to resort to paradoxes or anything like that. I didn't have to retcon anything. They just saw the bit, and they did. In improv, it's called playing the improv ninja. Or like you see the point that has to be played, dive in, put that block in, and then you back off again. And the player did it perfectly. It'll be very obvious to listeners when that goes off, but it was gorgeous, and it hasn't happened before or since.
Awesome.
I have one other, actually. I love NPCs that arise from just random practical improv. There was a game set in 1940s San Francisco, where the players lived on a houseboat in this dock with like loads of other houseboats, and I was constantly trying to emphasize to them that the sense of like there's no privacy, because everyone's very close to each other, and they kept having really like dangerous and confidential discussions just in their houseboat. So there was always the NPC who is their next door neighbor, who at some point would just chime in with their ideas, and just be like, "Shut up, Dave!" And it's like, I was just suggesting.
That's great.
That's fantastic. One of my favorite NPCs actually came up for basically the same reason. I set up a one shot, and the first thing the players did was something that I hadn't planned for. So I was like, okay, writing up NPCs on the fly. Here we go. And one of them stuck, and I developed a more fully fledged version of that NPC for other games later on. So, you've mentioned this a couple times, and this is a little bit separate from the other things, but the difference between performance play and sitting down and just enjoying a game at a table. Alex, can you elaborate more on what goes into that? Like what the difference is, and like what goes into performance play that makes it different?
So there is a common misconception as to what the main difference is. And the most common misconception I get is that people go, "Oh, I get it. It's what you do is you just play a game that you would play with friends, but what you do is you make sure you watch what you say." No, it's not that at all. What it actually entails a lot of is, everyone has their different styles. It relies a lot on good communication with your players. And it relies on an enormous amount of additional table etiquette, if I'm being honest. Those are the two core ones. That being the case of, in a normal table where like someone's like, black card, I'm not covering this topic, I'm not comfortable with it, I don't want to deal with it, and you honor that, good table etiquette. Well, you take that and you also add recording elements. You add things like, cool, someone will give a speech as a character and then go, I want to redo that speech. In a normal RPG game, you just go, cool, we retcon it to whatever you want, it's fine. In this, you go, okay, everyone stop. We're now rolling back the clock by about 5 minutes. Let's play this through again, please. And that kind of thing. And additionally requires a lot of discipline from your players, a lot of discipline, because on the one hand, people get very envious because they're like, oh, when I play my game, one player's always on their phone and there's always someone who's off making a cup of tea while stuff's playing out. And, that's just human nature and it's fine. Well, in the recording studio, it's sort of the inverse of that. Everyone is clued in the whole time, which is great, but everyone has something to contribute. And so it takes an enormous amount of discipline for just basic recording etiquette of don't speak over one another. Don't deny things. And you have to, again, like thankfully the majority of our cast came from an improv background. I used to teach improv for years, and you use a lot of the same core principles. One of them being the accept and build. I always, I put a couple of caveats in there. You don't build on something that is objectively awful, but that doesn't come up because I've chosen my players. But the accept and build principle really is more relying on the idea that if someone presents you something, it's incredibly important that everyone at the table hears that thing that's been presented and it becomes world extant. And it's the huge advantage of playing for performance is that everyone gets to be part of that. And it means that things roll along far quicker than in a normal campaign because people just listen. You don't get things dropping going, oh, wait, who was this character? Wait, there's an elephant in this room? Who put an elephant in this room? It doesn't happen because people are paying attention. But the flip side is that it can get quite intense. And I don't mean that in like we get at each other's throats, but there is a natural instinct sometimes to shy away from problematic story elements. And I don't mean problematic in terms of like, let's be hugely racist or something. That's not what I'm getting at, but more like engaging in themes of grief, engaging in themes of personal loss in a meaningful way. If you're going to do that on a recorded medium, you've got to do it properly. You've got to put your legwork in. You've got to check that the players are okay with it. You've got to lay things out, and you've got to be more open with your players than you would otherwise be. Where I'll have a sit down and go, if it was a normal RPG, I'd be like, listen, I'm going to try something. It doesn't work. We can bail on it. In this one, I'll have a sit down going, cool. I'm going to be examining the following themes. And a couple of times, the other one as well is you have to be aware that you can lose control of the story slightly without realizing it. And you need your players to keep you in check, which is something that is far bigger in playing for performance. So that's one where I will brief my players going, I am going to start touching on some pretty heavy material here. It would be incredibly useful for me if anyone can call me up if I misspeak, if I, accidentally like open a can of worms that I didn't mean to. And having players that you can rely on for that is incredibly important. So probably the biggest element for playing for performance more than anything else is you are incredibly cutthroat with who you allow at the table. And you don't get to play for performance with, your mates that you've got, that's fine. Don't get me wrong, I am now good friends with everyone that plays at the table. But Ben, one of our core characters, one of our core players even, I had never met, and he auditioned. He came in and played a game with us to see if he was a good fit. And we talked about what he wanted from a game, and we talked about how he related to RPGs and stuff like that. Helen, who is the latest addition to the group, same situation. I never knew Helen before this. We had a sit-down talk. We had a chat. We had invited her in to play a special, a ridiculous fifth ed special based in Beowulf, where the entire conceit relied on the fact that no one remembered she was there. And then we brought her back in going, okay, you're a good fit. Let's work with you. But you are so much more cutthroat. And also it is, unfortunately, it's very difficult to do playing for performance with a complete new player, where you're like, hey, let's introduce you to this gradually. Because on the one hand, they're a good in for listeners to learn the system. But on the other, there's an overhead to learning an RPG, and you're playing for other people's pleasure. And unfortunately, what that requires is either lots of editing, so it sounds like the new player got it like that, or you are more open about it, and there's a lot of revisiting the same stuff. But I could go on and on about this. Like, I've been doing it for years and years, and I realize I'm kind of tripping over myself at this point.
No,
I find like it's the difference between doing a card trick for your friends and doing a huge stage trick which requires a lot of plants.
Good analogy.
We've talked about that a lot ourselves, because we do run actual plays, or we're starting to on our channel. And I think one thing that I've found, and I don't know if this has come up, but when a friend does audition to be involved, and you're like, I'm sorry, it comes up.
You will end up saying no to people that you know. And you will have to just go.
And people who you've played great games with.
And it's
not just,
it doesn't mean you're a bad player.
Compatible player.
Exactly.
Exactly. The skill sets are related, but fundamentally very different. The skill it takes to the skill of making a private game good are to do with like bringing joy to the room. It's you can play your characters, you can dive in, and you sort of have a good time, and you can pepper it with in jokes, all this sort of stuff. But the skills that are required to perform play well are often a lot more structural as well, a lot more improvisational. It requires you to not just be well, what would my character do? Or even what would my character do that is fun, but what would my character do that contributes to the story that we're telling at the moment?
And it's not worth, I can't overstate it enough. Horror is the hardest one to play for performance. It is incredibly difficult to play horror RPGs for performance, because as your performers will have a natural instinct to play to if they're good performers, they'll have a natural instinct to play towards the audience. But what that tends to mean is jokes, undercutting the tone, and that's not them trying to sabotage. It is a learned response that you give in order to help boost energy levels through a performance. But for horror, that consistency,
and in the right places, it can amplify it.
Yeah, absolutely. But that to sustain that consistency of tone and to keep the stakes high in a way that is comfortable for an audience, so that they're not like, I'm checking out on this, but at the same time has some integrity to it. It's tricky. There's a reason we haven't done many horror specials, and it's because it's really hard to pull off well.
Yeah, like generally the horror specials that we do either have a humorous element laced through them, or Alex, you tend to you like to drop moments of horror into your wider non-horror game, which is very effective, but is not in the same way running a horror game.
And that's one where the only reason I can do that is because I go, hey, performer who's played the same character for 3 years, you care about them, don't you? Now I get to do this horror bit because they're invested, because they genuinely as a player are like, okay, this will have huge ramifications, I should lock in. But that's a luxury that not many people have, and 160 plus episodes is a useful tool to draw on at this point.
Fantastic. The last question I really have for each of you is directly tying the Magnus Archives to gaming in a sense. In the Magnus Archives, human emotions, particularly fear, are a major theme laced through the entire story. What in tabletop role-playing games are the best aspects of the human condition to explore?
Just
a nice light one to see us out.
To answer for this one, because I've actually been asked this before, so I've genuinely, like, in a couple of interviews something similar has come up, and straightforward for me is agency. RPGs are, when done properly, an engine for examining choice. Both player choice and character choice, and all being a GM really is deep down is going, here is a choice and here is a randomizing element, so you are not just picking arbitrarily between left and right. What's the choice? And every time you play, it's the one universal I can find in all RPGs is that, not preoccupation, but that focus upon choice and that focus upon character agency. A bad RPG is one where the players have no agency. There are other ways that an RPG can, go wrong or whatever, but ultimately, if your players have no agency, what you have there is a novel. And that idea of agency means that for me, any RPG that leans heavily into dealing with agency as a concept, dealing with the human condition, which is, what is from any angle, if you want to do something that's about time or time travel, what is the human condition but just a series of choices where the present is just the choice you're on at the moment? Or horror, it's examining, I don't know, the consequences of choices that are made blind. Or is this even a real choice?
Alex, no, it's about examining a horrible monster.
Oh, sorry, and the horrible monster just in
just like oozing and just like, horrible.
Genuinely, for me, I always end up looping it back round to every single game. All I do is hold up the system, hold up the setting, and then go, right, what aspects of agency does this want me to examine and focus on? And then I will draw story from that. And it's for me personally, this is not saying it's an absolute, but I always end up looping back into that no matter what system setting or like themes I'm engaging in.
For me, I think as a GM, the sort of the emotions and the elements that are most the RPGs are most effective at examining are, I mean, kind of linking into the idea of agency, are whatever the players want to, but not necessarily. Often they don't necessarily. Players fundamentally are kind of masochists, and your job as a GM is to give them the context where they can sort of emotionally hurt themselves in a safe way that they want to. And so, like, it's interesting playing with the same players in like lots of different campaigns, because you sort of start to get a sense of how different players, like what aspects of a character a player really likes to examine. Like, are they like? Do you find that a lot of their characters engage with the ideas of abandonment or like do all their characters struggle with sort of anger issues, and then like as you get a sense of that, you can look at the character and sort of construct scenarios that allow them to engage and develop that, and you also start to get a sense of like how they engage with that. Are they like, are they very much going to be keeping a light comedic tone until they're ready to break it? So you have to like make sure that they have clear flashpoints where their like light-hearted comedic character can suddenly take the turn towards serious drama that you know that they're looking for, or whether there's a player who really enjoys their character being drawn out, and so you need to make sure that the campaign is sort of laced with these moments which allow that player to hook on and draw out that character bit by bit. And so like a lot of it is one thing I really love doing is when going through backstories with players for their characters, making sure that they leave all names and locations blank, and then giving them those names, because generally they're not actually invested in whether they're like their old sergeant is called like
Phil. It must be Phil, Johnny. All right.
Yeah, like whether their old sergeant is called Phil or like Damian West, but wait, no, Damian West is a Batman character, isn't he? Whatever. But you know that Sergeant Damian is also in a different character's backstory, and if they're connected in that way, then that's going to set up these conflict and drama points further down the line. So much of it is sorry, the sun has shifted and I've got a lot of light on me suddenly. So much of it is learning your players and deciding what emotions do they want to explore, and giving them that right. That's obviously only for private games. In performance, it changes significantly again, because there are some things people
though. I think it's applicable in performance.
It is applicable, but there are some things people might not be comfortable exploring in a performative space that they are.
Sure, I would say it's less about exploring the depths of your players on performance side, and it's a bit more about, I know that if I provide this juicy theme, on it. But that's a in some ways a shallower but broader angle on what you're talking about.
Yeah,
absolutely. It's Damian Wayne, by the way.
Damian Wayne. Is Damian West a thing?
Adam West played Batman.
Adam West, maybe. Damian Wayne.
Maybe.
Although Damian Wayne played by Adam West, where no one acknowledges that it's Adam West, would be an interesting take. I would watch that.
That would be amazing.
We'll get back to you on that. Thank you for your pitch, Mr. Newall. We've got a lot of production aspects we need to go over, but we'll get back to you with our final decision.
That the 16th power was Adam West all along.
Oh no. On that note, thank you for joining me today, this afternoon for you, this morning for me. I really appreciate you taking the time and participating in Virtual Horror Con and letting me ask you a bunch of questions.
No problem. It's been loads of fun.
No, it's been genuinely a pleasure.
Thank you. What do you have coming up that you want to talk about, and where can people find you online?
After you, Johnny.
Do you want to? So obviously season 5 of the Magnus Archives has started last Thursday. So second episode will be dropping this Thursday, and it'll be going right through till the end. You can also find my tabletop work at MacGuffin and Company. I run that with Sasha Sienna, who was actually on a panel on horror and comedy yesterday. And we do sort of small systems, micro settings. Look us up on Itch, Patreon, all the sort of thing. It's MacGuffinandCompany.com. And I've got a book coming out in August called 13 Stories, Storeys, because it's a high-rise office, but it's very funny. If pre-order, keep a lookout for that, because I'm very, very excited because it's my first book.
Awesome. Alex?
From my perspective, very straightforward because I have literally no life. www.rustyquill.com. That contains links to all of our shows, and pretty much everything that I'm doing at this point is company related anyway. Obviously, given the nature of your audience, the Magnus Archives is a good one to hit up for the horror side. Rusty Quill Gaming podcast is our gaming focused podcast. We do both a long play, actual play, which has been running a while now, but we also do a lot of sort of one-off specials where we examine different systems. If people want a taster, I'd suggest probably maybe starting on one of the specials, and then if they like what they
I would recommend the Dusk Hollow PD special.
Would you, Johnny?
Yeah, the guy who runs it, who does the GMing, is I don't know. There's just something about his voice that just makes me feel safe. You know.
So yeah, Johnny has run a couple of games that are in that feed as well. Yep. And additionally, I'll keep drawing attention to it, which is that once a year we do a charity event called Rusty Quill Gaming and Giving, which is where we get a lot of personalities or RQ cast and so on into a room. And it used to be playing with a live audience where we play some games and stream it out. Obviously, with current situation, we're going to have to be losing the live audience part, but that means that we're leaning into it even harder as a thing that people can access from their own homes. And I know that previous iterations of that should be coming available soon in terms of things to watch. But yeah, it's a good one it's a good example of the kind of things that we're talking about in terms of, you know, how games can help people, how horror games as well have a place to play in people's lives. And I just thoroughly recommend people check them out. And for any information that you ever need to do with Rusty Quill, make the website your first port of call.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in for this wonderful interview. Johnny, Alex, thank you for joining me. And everyone, stay tuned for the next panel coming up in just a few minutes. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.